All right, looks like we got people are streaming in here. So let me introduce myself. My name is Benji Cohen. I'm the Mentor Network Coordinator for the DNR. And you have stumbled upon our Wednesday afternoon session for the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. An introduction to fly fishing class or talk, I guess, today. And the wonderful Melissa Bowman is joining us from the Minnesota Biological Survey, right? She's a small mammalist specialist and quite the angler. So thank you for joining us, Melissa.
Yeah, I'm excited to be on today to just share a little intro to fly fishing. I know that it's one of my favorite hobbies or ways to spend my free time. So hopefully this gives people a good start to kind of seeing what it is.
So I think we're good to get started. The Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. We just started this year. I think this is our third one now. It's run through the Fish and Wildlife Division of the DNR and Outreach section. And we're just here to talk about all kinds of topics involving the outdoors. So we did one on turkey hunting, introduction to turkey hunting our first week. Last week we did one on selecting a shotgun, how to select a shotgun if you're new to hunting and wanting to get into it. Maybe a couple more coming up on spring foraging and take them on fishing weekends, some walleye fishing, bass fishing, all kinds of fun stuff coming up here. So welcome everybody. I hope, and these sessions are being recorded, so you're more than welcome to come back and look at them, or if you find our information valuable enough, please feel free to share with your friends and share the link and have them come and look at it. So let's go on to the next one. And so like I said, my name is Benji Cohen. I'm the Mentor Network Coordinator. It's actually, I'm not a super, Melissa's a much more successful fly angler than I am. We'll put that out there right away. But I have been teaching kids and working in the fly, not working in the fly industry, but fly fishing, I guess, for several years. So that's a picture of me and my daughter down in Forestville State Park. We were down there fishing. So, and Melissa, I'll let you introduce yourself.
So I don't know how you define being a successful angler other than catching fish, but there's plenty of days I go out and don't catch fish as well. But I've been fly fishing for probably the last 5 years or so. It was a learning curve when I first started, but just keeping up with it, I've really just come to love all the opportunities, especially in Minnesota for fly fishing. So the photo I chose here was of a catfish. Caught right in Minneapolis off the Mississippi River. That's kind of one of my favorite spots to go and who's in there.
Awesome. So we're going to talk a little bit about equipment and terminology. Like Melissa was just mentioning, it is quite a learning curve coming in, and there's a couple of key differences I think between fly fishing and conventional fishing, I'll call it. In fly fishing, we're using really small, lightweight flies, so we have to use the actual line weight to cast that fly out there. So your rods and your reels come in different weights as well as in the line. So just from the top there is my largest rod. I believe that's a 10 weight rod used for muskies or northerns, and then below that is an 8 weight bass fishing rod, and then an old 7 weight rod that I use for kind of same thing, bass fishing, whatnot. And I have a 5 weight rod that is kind of the most common trout rod in Minnesota. And then I have a little 3 weight rod, is the bottom one there with the reels on. And again, part of learning this is learning to match the rod with the line weight. So the line weights on all these rods match the weight of the rod. And at the bottom there, I put a couple rods in that I got these when the kids were younger, and my girls are both now 11, and we still use them all the time. But the second to the last one there is a Tenkara rod from the Tenkara company. It's a Japanese company, but they're telescoping rods, and that one's about 11 feet long. And then right below that is a really cheap rod. Actually, I believe I bought that off of Amazon for like $6. It's only 6.5, 7 feet long, but they're great for kids. We use them for pan fishing all the time. Um, my bigger Tinkara rod there, I do use for trout fishing. The smaller one, I'm not sure it would handle a big trout. It handle most of the trout I catch. But Melissa, do you want to cover any terminology or more on rods and reels?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people get overwhelmed when first entering fly fishing just because gear can get really pricey, but there's a lot of really great kits that you can get, beginners kits that are more cost affordable. So don't get overwhelmed by all the options you have for what rods you can get, just more so focus on the size and what you want to be fishing for rather than the brand name and things like that. Because once you have a rod and start using it, you can learn what you like and don't like. So some of the terminology that you hear a lot with fly fishing is these words mentioned below: leader, tippet, and then nymphs, emergers, dry flies. That's what you're using to fish. And then the type of knots that you need to use. So this diagram just kind of illustrates what we're referring to with that terminology. So that orange line coming off the rod is the fly line. And that's what gives you the momentum or ability to throw these really lightweight flies. So if you took a spin rod and just tried to throw, something that weighs less than a piece of hair or something, because that's sometimes what you are throwing with flies, you're not going to get the momentum that you need. So the fly line really provides just the motion to be able to throw these lightweight flies. And then typically you have a leader connected to your fly line, and that's just monofilament that extends off the fly line. So you wouldn't necessarily be like, you would never connect a fly directly to your fly line because you still need that leader and that clear material versus this bright, chunky line in the water. So you have a leader that runs from the fly line down to what we call tippet, and that is just some additional line that you can add to the end of a leader, and more so that comes into play with trout fishing, where say you're on a stream that's very, very clear, you want to have very low visibility line so that those trout who can see very well aren't seeing the line attached to your fly, because you're looking for a natural presentation of insects or bugs or aquatic life in the water that these trout feed on, or that any fish feed on. So those leader and tippet come in different size, and as Benji mentioned, it's kind of correlated with the rod size. Well, not always, I guess, but it's correlated with the fish that you're looking for. So I included this graph of this chart of different sizes. And so as the number increases from 0x to say 6x, that higher number just indicates lower pound test line. So that means it's going to be more clear, it's going to be smaller. So that chart just kind of indicates what you usually fish for. And you just kind of consider the average weights that you might come across. So if you're fishing bigger fish, you want stronger line to hold those fish on there.
And I like to point out too with the leader, especially with kids, we buy a leader. It goes from our fly line to, you can fish a fly in the end of it. It's usually a tapered leader, so it starts out kind of thick and it goes to thin. And that's, everybody's probably seen a river runs through it where they're casting back and forth. And that tapered leader allows the fly to gently come down and set on the water, so it's not making a big splash. And by putting tippet on the end of that, it extends the life of that leader. So if you're paying a couple bucks for a leader, if you just tie your fly onto the end of it every time, you can probably still catch fish, especially if you're doing something bigger like bass or something like that. But having a little tippet on the end of it, you can change flies and just cut that tippet off. And that's just pretty much standard monofilament line. So
Yeah, that's a great point, Benji. So what is a fly? So they come in all different shapes and sizes, and I guess what people most often picture is dry flies on trout streams. So that I included that at the top. These are flies that usually sit on the surface and they mimic insects that are typically hatching off of a stream where trout are coming up and grabbing them. So that's like Benji mentioned with the tapered leader, getting it to lay out nice. You're usually presenting these bugs like they're naturally floating down a stream so that fish want to scoop them up. And then there's also streamers, and those are they're a lot bigger than dry flies. So the size is somewhat relative here on how big these flies are compared to each other. Um, and those are fish for just extremely wide variety. Trout will take them, but a lot of other fish will take them. And then nymphs, those are fished on the bottom, and that's a pretty common way to also fish for trout. They're supposed to mimic the insects that are about to hatch, or maybe grubs, things like that, that are subsurface underneath. So Benji, do you have any additional comments?
I personally, I think this is one of the coolest things about fly fishing is the variety of stuff. And you get into, I guess I feel much more connected with what I'm fishing with and the stream I'm in just by trying to learn about the bugs. So, all these little, in the very bottom, that little tiny nymph, one of the best fish I ever caught out in Colorado was on this, like number 22 SR2, they called it. I don't even know what it was supposed to mimic, but that's what they told me to use. So I was using it and caught like an 18-inch rainbow out of this little hole with this little tiny thing. It's super cool. But the whole idea behind fly fishing, right, is to mimic these aquatic insects called macroinvertebrates and how they live under the water and then they hatch out. So we have nymphs, streamers or emergers as they're coming up out of the water column. And then when they come back and lay their eggs, we have dry flies. So it's always, if you listen to people talk about fly fishing, they'll talk about a hex hatch or some kind of a mayfly hatch. Everybody's familiar with those around Minnesota, mayfly hatches, but all those bugs go back and lay eggs in the water, and when they land in the water to lay their eggs, the trout are just feeding like crazy. So if you can time that right and have an appropriate sized fly that mimics that bug, is just super cool. It's like you're tricking a super smart fish that has really good vision into eating your fly instead of a real bug. So, and all these, I
Yeah, and
don't know.
it's funny when you see those hatches, sometimes these fish are just popping off eating something, but you can't always throw anything because sometimes they're really cued into whatever that specific insect is and might be looking for that size or that color or that shape. So that's kind of where the fun comes in of matching the hatch with the
Yeah.
flies and paying attention to what insects are out there.
And just as a side note, like I don't know if you tie, Melissa. Do you tie flies?
Yeah, actually, a lot of these I've tied. Not the dry flies as much, but I love tying streamers and crayfish patterns, and then I also really like tying nymphs too. So with fly fishing, there's also just a totally completely different world of tying flies. So you can make these at home, which is just a really fun pastime as well. And I would say it's probably a whole other monster from fly fishing because you can get really into creating these super cool patterns. And it's really exciting when you tie something up and go out and catch a fish on it. That's just a really good feeling.
It is super cool. And there's some great groups around the cities to introduce you to that. That's a whole other topic, but it's a really cool hobby to do in the winter too. So
Yep. So these flies are typical of trout. The streamers in the middle can be a wide variety of fish, and panfish, of course, will take those nymphs. Anything that looks buggy, panfish will take. So that's just kind of one set of flies. But then as you get to some of the bigger fish like pike or muskie, things can start getting a lot bigger. So that's where you kind of want that bigger rod setup. Like Benji mentioned, he has a 10 weight for pike and muskie. And, as the flies get bigger and start to mimic actual fish, then you really need that stronger rod to throw such a big fly. But again, the weight is not enough to put on a spin rod and throw it. So you still need that fly line. So I just put two examples here of some streamers. The one on the left, the yellow one, starts to get pretty big. That's a really nice pike fly. And then the rest you can see they kind of mimic fish. So there's a sculpin mimic in the middle. And then I included that woolly bugger just to show you the size of how that increases as you kind of start to fish some of those river fish. Another really fun type of fly is called a popper. And that's basically a surface fly that is used for bass quite a bit, and you just swim it over the surface. So it's almost like like spin fishing with a frog lure or something that's over the surface. And that's really fun to catch fish on the fly with surface eats with poppers. So I included just a photo of a rock bass because that's a species that would typically take flies like this. So the thing that I love about fishing in Minnesota is that there's a lot of variety. And I think when folks think of fly fishing, you just immediately think of Montana and fishing trout streams out west. But the cool thing about Minnesota and having the Mississippi River, Minnesota River, there's just a range of cool species that you can get into. So Benji, if you want to talk about trout and some other species that you enjoy too.
Yeah, I kind of got into fly fishing on trout when I lived out in Colorado, and it was just trout was a big species. So, and then moving back to Minnesota, I grew up here, but a lot of spin fishing and playing in trout streams and mostly on the river actually. So, but moving back here, the fisheries we have for trout is, and I kid you not, it's probably the most underrated trout fisheries between the Rockies and the East Coast. It is we have a phenomenal spot here in Minnesota, the driftless area in the southeast, and um, I forget the number of designated trout streams we have, but there's a ton of them, and there's a lot of water out there. But they're also probably the hardest species to catch. I mean, besides like a muskie, they say it's a fish of 1,000 casts, but um, trout are tough. You got to be sneaky. You're in clear water with a fish that sees really well. So um, starting out, with the kids and stuff, pan fishing was the way to go. And we got Evan Griggs from Bob Mitchell's Fly Shop is doing a presentation in our next month in our chapter, just talking about fishing for carp is one of his favorite things to do on the fly. And it's a great, I've never even tried it. I got to get out with Evan or Melissa one of these times to chase carp because that sounds like it would just be a blast. But um, yeah,
Yeah,
there's a
it's
lot of
super
species that are
fun.
fun.
Yeah, with carp, it's kind of funny because they're known as kind of the poor man's bonefish because bonefish are a very popular saltwater species in like Mexico and in the ocean. And they're very picky. So carp are a really good species to practice on for some of those saltwater species. So that's kind of fun. Um, but yeah, that's kind of my favorite part about living in Minnesota. And, some species I didn't even know about until I started fly fishing and kind of started dorking out about all the potential species. So one of that there's pictured in the lower corner is a quillback, and they have just a beautiful dorsal fin that sticks out. And then I also like to fish for some of the micro species. So that lower picture on the right is a common shiner, which are actually pretty fun to get on the fly too. So it can be, like I said, it can be kind of overwhelming thinking about all the gear you need and what's leader and tippet and what knots do you need. But I just kind of put this basic quick start list together. For Minnesota, if you want to get out and you want to try fly fishing, your best setup is going to be a 5-weight rod because that's a common trout size rod and something that can be used for a range of species, especially panfish. It's really fun to catch them on the 5-weight. So I recommend a 5-weight rod, and then for leaders and tippet, just look for 3 to 5X. That's a good general size, a little bit smaller. And then for if you are fishing bluegill, it's really important to have forceps because their mouths are so small and they will inhale flies. So you just really need those forceps to help get that out of their mouth sometimes. And then some snips for cutting line, a container for carrying your different flies, and then patience with yourself for sure, because it can be a learning curve, but once you start to see your progress, for me, it was on a trout stream. I couldn't cast for anything when I first started, but throughout the summer, I worked on it, and eventually it was a huge accomplishment to see my cast lay out really nicely. And then after that, it was a huge accomplishment to get my first trout on the fly. Like it's just really fun to progress through this hobby. So I just included this slide because like, the flies, there's a lot of different choices. What should I use? And I would say above all, if you don't know, use a woolly bugger. that definitely catches the most fish for sure. It's great for the metro area for throwing into lakes. I've caught all sorts of species on this fly, and it's one that I always make sure that I have in my box. So for places to go, Benji, if you want to touch on this side.
Yeah, we just had a question on that, Melissa, and I think you just kind of answered it too. Is um, let's see if I can move up and read it here. I think it was 5 to 10 flies that you would suggest going out, and what sizes. And it's exactly what I said. The woolly bugger in a few different sizes. One of my favorites is a pheasant tail nymph.
Mm-hmm.
Works on just about everything. And a pink squirrel. They're kind of the old standbys that everybody fishes with. And if you get them in, 3 or 4 different sizes, you're going to be pretty successful with just that. So, um, for places to go, we live in an awesome state with almost 12,000 lakes. We have 700 miles of designated trout streams and 16,000 miles of fishable rivers and streams. Um, the really cool thing about fly fishing, I think, is it's a fairly low entry point. You can, buy a fairly reasonable set of waders, or if it's warm in the summer, you don't even need waders. You can just wade in. Um, so as long as you're going to, a nice access where you can, public access, make sure you're not trespassing, but you can find a lot of great places to go and fish, and you don't need to buy a boat or anything like that, and you can access some incredible water and probably, in my opinion, some of the most beautiful places in Minnesota. So, if you go to the DNR website, the DNR Lake Finder is a great place to go and find access points in different lakes. There's also a program we run called Fin Fishing the Neighborhood. If you're in the 7 county metro area, that highlights, like in the lower left there, that's actually a boat launch, but we have docks designated for fishing in lakes and ponds that are purposefully stocked with bluegills, like in that top picture there. So we have a new application on our site. It's called Stream Finder. If you go on our site and Google trout fishing, it'll pop up and you'll be able to see all the designated trout streams in Minnesota and find where those are. And if there's any special regulations or anything on those, that'll pop up in there too. So there's a great Minnesota trout guide the DNR puts out. We haven't published yet for a couple years. It is available online in PDF form too, but it does come in a booklet also. Um, and I'm doing this upstairs in my kitchen instead of my office, but in my office I have my 2 books, one for Wisconsin fly fishing, um, and then a Bob Travis book on fly fishing in Minnesota that has a bunch of great tips and tricks and streams to check out. And obviously, the state, county, public parks, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention your local fly shops. There, if you see a fly shop around anywhere in the metro area or anywhere in the state, if you stop in there and say, I'm just starting out, this is what I have, um, give me 5 bugs that would be good for today. They will help you out and point you in the right direction. They're super friendly, and it's a great place to start. So,
For sure. Yeah, and I would say my favorite part about fly fishing is that it has taken me all over in Minnesota, and seeing the driftless for the first time was really just like, wow, this exists here. So I would say it's super fun to explore with a rod, and all these resources will hopefully help you find a spot. I often use just like Lake Finder to just find a dock. Sometimes if I just have a little bit of time to kill, and it's a great opportunity to go just catch a bunch of bluegill. So yeah, these are awesome spots in Minnesota. We're pretty lucky.
so we get a couple upcoming dates that are coming up. The spring trout opener is um, coming up here this Saturday. So you get rough fish spearing, and these dates are just coming up, so not necessarily any reason. Can't obviously fly fish for rough fish spearing, but you can rough fish for them. Take them on fishing weekend is coming up the weekend before the fishing opener this year, so it's a great way to um, maybe introduce mom or another friend to fly fishing. Get out on a local lake and try something. Moms don't need a fishing license that weekend, so obviously you can't be out targeting bass or walleye or something because they're not open yet. But the pan fishing is usually pretty darn good that time of year. So, of course, our big fishing opener in Minnesota, almost a national statewide holiday, is the 15th. And bass opener is, Melissa, do you bass fish much on the fly?
Yeah, whenever I can get on the river and float.
So I've only, and I only live a couple blocks from the St. Croix, but I haven't been out there bass fishing like I should. And I got to go pick up my boat motor today. I get a little 9.9 horse. I want to go float the river, and I got to get a motor to get up it so I can get back to my truck because I don't want to have the drop and all that hassle. But um, yeah, I'm chomping at the bit this year to get out and do a little more bass fishing on the fly rod. So, and the muskie opener's coming up too. So, we did have a couple questions in there. Um, Jeff, thank you for putting stuff in. Oh, sorry about that. My daughter just came home. For putting some of that stuff in the Q&A, but we did have a couple questions in there, Melissa, in about some key flies, about retrieval of woolly buggers or different fly fishing.
Yeah, that's a great question actually, because with those different fly types, there's different methods that you're using to fish them. So dry flies and nymphs, for example, you're typically trying to present naturally how they would be drifting down a stream. So you're really focused on reading that water and looking at the current. But when it comes to woolly buggers, which is also maybe why I like them so much, you are just casting it out there, like how you picture somebody fly fishing with the rod moving. I would say actually with dries and nymphs, you're less doing that motion, but with the woolly buggers, you are throwing it, and then when you retrieve it, what you're doing is what we call a strip, and that's where you're holding your fly line and you pull it towards you. So maybe like this motion. So this is a strip, and that's how you retrieve the woolly bugger. It can be different by different water conditions, but overall, you just kind of let it get closer to the bottom and then slowly pull it back towards you. And there's something about the way it swims that just fish love it. So
Talk to myself on mute there. I'm just trying to answer a couple questions in the Q&A here. One of them is, are the trout in the driftless region mostly small and mostly of one type or the other? And I would say no, they're not mostly small. There's some great fish down there. And depending on the stream you go to, I mean, rainbows are fairly common, but I think browns are doing very well down there. And some streams have great populations of brook trout. Brook trout are one of my favorite things to target also. So
yeah, brook trout are just super beautiful fish. So it's always really fun, especially when you get towards the fall and they get really colored up. Same with the browns, they get colored up in the fall before they spawn. Um, but yeah, it's kind of amazing the size fish that you can encounter in Minnesota. And same, you mentioned that one of your best fish was caught on one of the smallest flies that you've ever used, and that's the same for me. It's kind of surprising when you throw this little tiny nymph that's not even the size of your fingernail, and this huge fish will take it. So I've had like also an 18-inch trout on a tiny nymph. So we have a great fishery in Minnesota here for trout.
somebody also asked about the presentation for carp fishing. Do you have more information on that? So I've never fished carp on a fly. I have heard they actually do come to the surface to eat sometime. Is
They
that true or?
They will from time to time. It kind of depends. Like, for example, if there's cottonwood seed hatch, so the cottonwood trees will release their seeds, and sometimes that'll just cover these kind of backwater areas where carp will typically be. And they'll take that off the surface. They'll eat those little cottonwood seed flies. So some people do tie those and catch carp that way, but I would say the biggest or the most important fly for carp would be a John Montana carp hybrid fly. And what it is, it basically has a little wormy tail with a collar, or what we call just kind of like a feathered collar that makes it look really buggy, kind of leggy. And so typically with carp, you can sight fish them, which is really fun. And they're foraging. You can see them moving around looking for things. And how they forage is they use their sense of smell and their sense of touch and their eyesight. They can actually see really well, and they're kind of spooky. So they're kind of foraging on the bottom. So when you present a fly, you're trying to target where they're going. So you're presenting it in front of them, letting it sink, and then you just kind of watch to see if it'll take it. But carp are pretty picky, and because they can smell so well, often you'll see them just reject your fly. So that's kind of the fun part about carp, is that they're a little tricky, but when you get one, they can run, they can pull your line, and that's a really fun way to fight a fish on the fly rod, is when they're just cruising and your line is just coming out, and then you bring them back.
Awesome. I definitely got to get out and try that.
Mm-hmm. And especially with the Mississippi right here, there's a lot of opportunity for carp fishing. Kind of unfortunately because they are so invasive and move in, but yeah, we have an abundance of carp that we can fish for around the metro, that's for sure.
So, and another question was, are there fly fishing groups in the Twin Cities area? And yes, there are several. If you go to any fly shop, a lot of them will. I know Orvis is doing some beginner classes right now. A lot of the local fly shops will be doing some kind of classes. I is a, I guess, a partial shameless plug here. I guess I will plug the local Twin Cities Trout Unlimited chapter. I'm actually a member of that chapter. So we do, and we're starting this summer, we're going to start doing some more classes and stuff just to introduce people to fly fishing and help improve their casting and whatnot. It's a great organization to become a member of. And, if you're just looking for people to give you tips and hints and stuff, come to meetings anytime. Look the chapters up. And there's chapters, 6 of them all across the state of Minnesota, and there's a bunch in Wisconsin too. They're all over the country. Fly Fishing Internationals, there's a few chapters in the cities. The Lou Jewett chapter is the local one down here. There's one up north, but they're kind of like the casting specialist of organizations, I guess. They actually have a certified caster program you can go through. But and the DNR Learn to Fish pages has some great information, both in PDF form on like kind of how to set up your rod and casting techniques and stuff. So hitting any one of those places up is great. And somebody else asked me for those books. I just posted those in the chat, but probably shouldn't. Bob Trevis's book on fly fishing Southeast Minnesota. There's probably 50 books on that out there, and there's a Improved Waters of Wisconsin that highlights a lot of the trout streams in Wisconsin too. So those are two of them I keep handy next to my fly fishing stuff, ready to go, or in my truck. So if you see any other questions out there, any closing thoughts, Melissa?
I just hope that this presentation kind of shows you the possibilities of fly fishing. I mean, it's a great hobby to get involved with, and it's just really fun learning kind of the natural history of these species, being out in the environment and just kind of paying attention to what's right in front of you. That's very much my favorite hobby, is just reading water and being a part of that environment, sneaking through the grass so I don't scare trout and things like that. It's always an adventure when you go fly fishing.
Melissa, there was a request to go back to the equipment slide. If you could maybe move the
Yeah.
PowerPoint back to that.
This slide or the quick list?
They did not really say. Equipment slide.
I'll go back to the quick start because that's typically a bare bones list of what you need, but
Just trying to grab a link to paste in here too. Somebody asked about, I'm going to put that in the chat. Just a link to the DNR pages that I was referencing earlier. So everybody can click on that. One other question, I know we're out of time, so if anybody has to go, feel free, but one of the other questions, they just keep popping in. Do you spray your flies with any fish or salmon smell? I've seen people do that. And I can't say as I have put like floatant, what they call floating on a fly that keeps it more water repellent, so it floats better. But I don't know, Melissa, do you have any experience with that?
Yeah, I've never put scent on a fly. I would imagine it, especially like a woolly bugger or something where it could soak it up. I'm sure it would help. But yeah, I guess you don't often need to use scent with the flies because it's more mimicking an insect rather than attracting by scent or like with worms, you're looking at scent that you're attracting fish with, but with the fly, it's more mimicking something.
And somebody asked about recommending, if you're just starting out, would you recommend starting with wading or floating? I guess, what's your opinion on that?
I guess if you're used to floating for spin fishing already, then there's no reason not to jump in that way. With wading, it's nice because you're kind of more in control of where you're fishing and what you're targeting, so you can kind of get a little bit of better practice, especially, on our little trout streams. I mean, it's really fun to just wade and look for fish. So
Somebody else did ask about trout fishing in northern streams of Minnesota. There's a ton of water that flows into the Lake Superior up there. I have not fished a whole lot up there. The steelhead fishing is phenomenal this time of year. From what I've been hearing, people are doing really well up there. And you can fish up there in a lot of those small streams. But do you have any experience up in northern Minnesota, Melissa?
yeah, so on the streams on the North Shore, there is a good brook trout fishery on most of those streams. And it's awesome fishing up there because it's, those rivers are really beautiful and really powerful. So it's really fun to pull brook trout there. And I've done a little bit of steelheading on the North Shore, which is also really fun, but it definitely is a very popular sport this time of year up there.
Great. And any other questions? I think that looks like we got them all. So thank you everybody for joining the talk today. Like I said, you can reach out to either Melissa or I. I'm the mentor network coordinator at the DNR, so you can find me on the internet there, or look at our website, ask any questions. But I would highly recommend anybody check out some of the local chapters of Trout Unlimited or some of those other groups that I pointed out a little bit earlier. They're great resources to get going, and trout fishing or fly fishing in general is a great hobby. You can, just like everything else, you can spend as much money as you want or start as cheaply as you want and learn. It's a great way to learn about especially water and bugs and fish. So any closing remarks from you, Melissa?
No, I just hope somebody in this talk ends up going out to try it. That's all.
Well, I hope we see 100 new people out in the streams this summer. It's a great hobby and it's a great way to get outdoors and enjoy some of the lovely scenery around Minnesota. So I think with that, we'll say goodbye to everybody. I'll stop the recording and we can hop back into our closed session here.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Pop us back.